William Crapo Durant was born in December 1861 in Boston, Massachusetts, the grandson of a Michigan lumber baron who had already lost most of his fortune by the time William was a child. His father abandoned the family when Durant was 2 years old. He was not an engineer. He was not a mechanic. He did not come from automotive money, and he had no technical training in the machinery that would later make him one of the most powerful industrialists in America. What he had was an extraordinary ability to sell, to organize, and to see opportunity where others saw only risk. By the time he was 16, Durant had dropped out of high school and was working at his grandfather's lumberyard in Flint, Michigan. He sold cigars. He sold patent medicine. He worked as a clerk. In 1886, at age 24, he noticed a horse-drawn cart with unusually smooth suspension. He bought the patent rights to the cart's design for $50 and convinced a local hardware manufacturer named Josiah Dallas Dort to partner with him. They called their venture the Flint Road Cart Company. Durant's approach was simple but unusual for the time. He did not build carts first and then try to sell them. He took orders first, sometimes hundreds at a time, and then arranged for production. Within 2 years, the Durant-Dort Carriage Company was producing more than 50,000 vehicles annually, making it one of the largest carriage manufacturers in the United States. Durant was becoming wealthy, respected, and powerful in Flint, a city whose economy he was beginning to dominate. By 1900, the carriage industry was mature and stable, but a new form of transportation was beginning to appear on American roads. Gasoline-powered automobiles were still rare, expensive, and considered unreliable. Most were built by small workshops or ambitious mechanics working in converted carriage factories. Production was measured in dozens, not thousands. The machines were temperamental. They broke down frequently. There was no standardization of parts, no network of repair shops, and no infrastructure for fuel distribution. Wealthy hobbyists bought them. Serious businessmen did not. Durant watched this emerging industry with interest but did not immediately enter it. He understood that the carriage business was still profitable, and the automobile business was still speculative. In 1904, a struggling automobile company in Flint called Buick Motor Company was on the verge of collapse. It had been founded by a Scottish immigrant named David Dunbar Buick, a skilled plumber and inventor who had developed a method for bonding porcelain to cast iron, which made him moderately successful. Buick then became obsessed with building a gasoline engine. He spent all his money developing a valve and head engine design that was more powerful and efficient than most engines of the time. But Buick was an inventor, not a businessman. By 1904, the company had produced fewer than 40 cars and was deeply in debt. Local investors in Flint, many of whom had backed the company, were facing total loss. They approached Durant, asking if he would take control and salvage what he could. Durant was reluctant. He test drove a Buick car on a road outside Flint and was impressed by its power and reliability, but he knew nothing about manufacturing automobiles. However, he saw something the others did not. If the automobile was going to replace the horse-drawn carriage, the opportunity was not in building a few expensive machines for wealthy customers. The opportunity was in producing thousands of reliable, affordable cars for a mass market that did not yet exist. Durant agreed to take over Buick, but only if he had complete control. David Buick was kept on as a salaried employee with no authority. Within months, he was pushed out entirely, bitter and penniless, and would die in obscurity decades later. Durant applied the same strategy to Buick that he had used with carriages. He did not wait to build cars and then sell them. He took orders first, often by traveling to automobile shows and dealer conventions with nothing more than sketches and promises. At the 1905 New York Auto Show, Durant took orders for more than 1,000 Buicks. The company had not yet built that many cars in its entire existence. He returned to Flint and demanded that production be scaled up immediately. Factories were expanded. New workers were hired. Suppliers were locked into contracts. By 1906, Buick produced over 1,400 cars. By 1907, it produced over 4,600. Durant reinvested every dollar of profit back into expansion. He was not interested in steady, cautious growth. He wanted scale, and he wanted it immediately. This approach required constant access to capital. Banks were skeptical of the automobile industry and reluctant to lend large sums to a business with no proven long-term viability. Durant instead relied on a network of wealthy investors, many of them from Flint and Detroit, who were willing to gamble on his vision. He sold stock, issued bonds, and promised returns that seemed almost impossible. In many cases, he delivered. Buick's rapid growth made early investors wealthy, which in turn made it easier for Durant to raise more money for further expansion. By 1908, Buick was the largest automobile manufacturer in the United States, producing over 8,800 cars, more than Ford, more than any other competitor. But Durant was not satisfied with Buick alone. He believed that the future of the automobile industry would not be dominated by a single company producing a single car. He believed the future belonged to a combination of companies, each serving a different segment of the market, all under unified financial and managerial control. In September 1908, Durant incorporated a new holding company in New Jersey. He called it General Motors Company. The structure was simple. General Motors would acquire other automobile manufacturers, absorb their assets, manage their operations, and use the combined scale to negotiate better prices with suppliers, dominate dealer networks, and crush smaller competitors. It was an idea borrowed from the railroad and steel industries, where consolidation had already created monopolies. Durant believed the same strategy would work in automobiles. The first acquisition was Buick itself. Durant transferred Buick's assets into General Motors and received stock in the new holding company in return. Buick remained the foundation, the profit engine that would fund everything else. Within weeks, Durant made his next move. He approached the Olds Motor Works, another Michigan-based company that had been one of the most successful automobile manufacturers in the early 1900s. Olds had pioneered mass production techniques and created one of the first truly popular American cars, the curved-dash Oldsmobile. But internal disputes and conservative management had slowed its growth. Durant offered to buy the company for $3 million. The Olds board accepted, and in November 1908, Oldsmobile became part of General Motors. Durant moved quickly. In 1909, he acquired the Oakland Motor Car Company, a small manufacturer based in Pontiac, Michigan. Oakland was not profitable, but it had a factory, a dealer network, and a brand. Durant believed he could make it profitable under General Motors management. He acquired Cadillac Automobile Company, a Detroit-based manufacturer of high-quality, precision-engineered luxury cars. Cadillac had been founded by Henry Leland, a machinist and engineer who was obsessed with interchangeable parts and strict quality control. Leland had no interest in mass production or market expansion. He wanted to build the best car possible. Durant paid $4.5 million for Cadillac, the largest acquisition General Motors had made. Leland stayed on to run Cadillac as a semi-independent division, and his engineering discipline brought a level of technical credibility to General Motors that Buick alone could not provide. Durant did not stop. He attempted to acquire the Ford Motor Company. Henry Ford, who by 1909 had introduced the Model T and was beginning his own push toward mass production, was willing to sell for $8 million, but only if the payment was made entirely in cash. Durant could not raise that much cash quickly enough, and the deal collapsed. He attempted to acquire the Maxwell Briscoe Company, another large independent manufacturer. Negotiations failed. He acquired dozens of smaller companies, truck manufacturers, parts suppliers, coach builders. Many of these acquisitions were hasty, poorly evaluated, and would later prove to be worthless. But in the moment, Durant was building an empire at a speed that no one in the automobile industry had ever attempted. By the end of 1910, General Motors controlled more than a dozen automobile brands, held patents on critical technologies, and had annual production capacity exceeding 40,000 vehicles. But the expansion had been reckless. Many of the smaller acquisitions were losing money. Inventories were piling up. Cash flow was strained. Durant had borrowed heavily to finance the acquisitions, and the loans were coming due. In the fall of 1910, General Motors was on the verge of bankruptcy. Durant approached a consortium of banks in Boston and New York, asking for a loan of $15 million to stabilize General Motors and allow the company to continue operating. The bankers examined the company's financial records and were horrified by what they found. General Motors had acquired companies with almost no due diligence. Several divisions were producing cars that no one wanted to buy. Factories were running at partial capacity. Debt obligations were scattered across multiple subsidiaries with no central coordination. The bankers agreed to provide the loan, but only under strict conditions. Durant would be removed as president of General Motors. A banking committee would take control of the company's finances and operations for a period of 5 years. Durant could remain on the board of directors, but he would have no executive authority. Durant had no choice. He accepted the terms. In November 1910, he was forced out of active control of the company he had created. The bankers installed new management, led by Charles W. Nash, who had been running Buick's manufacturing operations. Nash was cautious, methodical, and focused on profitability rather than expansion. He immediately began shutting down unprofitable divisions, selling off excess inventory, and tightening financial controls. General Motors stabilized, but it stopped growing. The bankers were satisfied. Durant was not. He still owned a significant amount of General Motors stock, and he had no intention of remaining sidelined. Within months of being removed from General Motors, Durant began working on a new automobile venture. In 1911, he co-founded the Chevrolet Motor Company with a Swiss-born racing driver named Louis Chevrolet. The company was officially based in Detroit, but Durant controlled it entirely. Louis Chevrolet was the public face, the name, and the designer of the first models, but he had no real power. Durant's plan was simple. He would build Chevrolet into a successful, independent automobile company, use its profits and stock value to buy back control of General Motors, and then absorb Chevrolet into the larger empire. The first Chevrolet model, introduced in 1912, was a large, expensive touring car designed to compete with luxury brands. It was well built and well received, but it was not what Durant wanted. He wanted a car that could compete with the Ford Model T, which by 1912 was dominating the low-cost market and selling hundreds of thousands of units per year. Louis Chevrolet disagreed. He believed the company should focus on quality and craftsmanship, not cheap mass production. Durant overruled him. Louis Chevrolet left the company in 1913, furious and humiliated, his name now attached to a brand he no longer controlled. Durant redirected Chevrolet towards smaller, simpler, cheaper models. In 1914, Chevrolet introduced the Series H, also known as the Baby Grand, a light touring car priced at $875, and the Series L, a roadster priced at $750. These models were not as cheap as the Model T, which by then cost around $500, but they offered more features, better comfort, and greater style. Chevrolet's sales grew rapidly. By 1915, the company was producing over 13,000 cars annually, and generating enough profit to fund Durant's next move. Durant began quietly buying General Motors stock. He used Chevrolet's cash, he borrowed from investors, and he convinced other wealthy backers to purchase shares on his behalf. The stock price was low because General Motors, under the cautious management of the bankers, was growing slowly and paying only modest dividends. Many shareholders were frustrated and willing to sell. Durant was patient. He did not announce his intentions. He simply accumulated shares, month by month, year by year. By 1915, he had gained effective control of Chevrolet and was using the company as a vehicle to reclaim General Motors. In September 1915, Durant made his move. He called a special shareholders meeting and revealed that he and his allies now controlled enough General Motors stock to retake the board of directors. The bankers were stunned. They had assumed Durant was finished. They had underestimated his determination and his ability to raise capital. In May 1916, Durant was reinstated as president of General Motors. Charles Nash, who had been running the company competently but conservatively, resigned and left to start his own automobile company. The bankers withdrew. Durant was back in control, and this time he had a stronger foundation. One of his first decisions was to bring Chevrolet into General Motors. In 1918, Chevrolet officially became a division of General Motors, not as a subsidiary but as a fully integrated part of the company. This gave General Motors a direct competitor to Ford in the low-cost market, something it had lacked during Durant's first tenure. Buick remained the company's profit leader, but Chevrolet was positioned for mass-market dominance. Durant also restructured General Motors' internal organization. He created a divisional structure where each brand, Chevrolet, Buick, Oldsmobile, Cadillac, Oakland, operated semi-independently with its own management, engineering teams, and production facilities, but shared resources like purchasing, advertising, and dealer networks. This structure allowed each brand to target a different market segment without cannibalizing each other. Chevrolet would sell to budget-conscious buyers. Buick would sell to middle-class families seeking reliability and status. Oldsmobile would sell to buyers who wanted something more refined than Chevrolet but less expensive than Buick. Cadillac would sell to wealthy customers who demanded luxury and prestige. Oakland would serve a niche between Chevrolet and Oldsmobile. The strategy was called a car for every purse and purpose, and it became the defining logic of General Motors for decades. But Durant's ambitions extended beyond automobiles. He began acquiring companies that produced automotive parts and components. In 1918, General Motors acquired the Guardian Refrigerator Company, a manufacturer of electric refrigerators, which became the foundation of the Frigidaire division. Durant believed that General Motors should control as much of its supply chain as possible to reduce dependence on outside suppliers and capture more profit at every stage of production. He acquired parts manufacturers, coach builders, and accessory companies. He invested in research on new materials, new engines, and new production techniques. He pushed General Motors into aviation by acquiring a stake in several aircraft manufacturers, though these ventures never became profitable. During World War I, General Motors shifted a significant portion of its production capacity to military contracts. The company manufactured trucks, ambulances, aircraft engines, and artillery shells for the U.S. government. The war accelerated the development of new manufacturing techniques and introduced General Motors engineers to mass production methods that would later be applied to civilian automobile production. The war also proved that large-scale industrial mobilization was possible and that American factories could produce vehicles at a speed and volume that European manufacturers could not match. By 1918, General Motors was the largest automobile manufacturer in the United States, surpassing Ford in total production volume. The company employed over 85,000 workers and operated factories in Flint, Detroit, Pontiac, Lansing, and several other cities across Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and beyond. General Motors' dealer network extended into nearly every major city and town in the country. The company was profitable, powerful, and still expanding. But Durant's management style had not changed. He made decisions impulsively, often without consulting his executives or his board of directors. He acquired companies based on intuition rather than financial analysis. He borrowed heavily to finance new ventures, believing that rapid growth would always generate enough revenue to cover the debts. He speculated in General Motors stock, sometimes buying shares with borrowed money to drive up the price, which inflated the company's market value but created financial instability. His senior executives, many of whom were experienced engineers and managers, grew frustrated with his erratic leadership. The board of directors, which included representatives from major financial institutions, began to lose confidence in his ability to manage a company that had grown far beyond the scale of the carriage business he had once dominated. In 1920, the American economy entered a sharp recession. Automobile sales collapsed. General Motors' inventory of unsold cars piled up in warehouses and dealer lots. The company's stock price dropped rapidly. Durant, who had borrowed millions of dollars to buy General Motors shares during the previous year, was suddenly facing margin calls from his creditors. If he could not pay, He would be forced to sell his stock, which would drive the price down further and potentially trigger a financial panic that could destroy General Motors entirely. Durand attempted to stabilize the stock price by buying more shares, but he did not have enough cash. He approached the DuPont Company, a chemical manufacturer that had become enormously wealthy during World War I by producing explosives for the Allied powers. Pierre S. DuPont, the head of the DuPont Company, had been an investor in General Motors since 1914 and already owned a significant amount of stock. Durand asked DuPont for help. DuPont agreed, but only if Durand stepped down permanently. In November 1920, Durand resigned as president of General Motors for the second and final time. Pierre DuPont took over as president, and the DuPont Company acquired enough additional stock to become the controlling shareholder of General Motors. Durand left General Motors with nothing. His personal fortune, which had once been valued at over $100 million, was gone. He attempted to start new automobile ventures in the 1920s and 1930s, but none succeeded. He declared bankruptcy in 1936. He spent his final years managing a bowling alley in Flint, the city he had once dominated. He died in 1947, forgotten by most of the public and by the industry he had helped create. Pierre S. DuPont was 60 years old when he assumed control of General Motors in 1920. He was a chemist by training, a financial manager by experience, and a believer in systematic organization. He had transformed the DuPont Company from a family-run explosives business into one of the most efficiently managed industrial corporations in the world by implementing strict financial controls, centralized planning, and decentralized operational responsibility. He intended to apply the same principles to General Motors, but he had no desire to run an automobile company indefinitely. He was looking for someone who could stabilize General Motors, impose order on its chaotic structure, and prepare it for long-term growth. He found that person in Alfred Pritchard Sloan Jr. Sloan was born in May 1875 in New Haven, Connecticut, the son of a prosperous coffee and tea importer. He attended the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he studied electrical engineering and graduated in 1895. He was not charismatic. He was not a salesman. He did not have Durand's instinct for opportunity, or his willingness to take enormous risks. What Sloan had was an extraordinary capacity for organization, analysis, and disciplined thinking. After college, he went to work for the Hyatt Roller Bearing Company, a small manufacturer of anti-friction bearings used in machinery and automobiles. Within a few years, he had become the company's president. In 1916, Durand acquired Hyatt as part of his strategy to control General Motors' parts supply chain, and Sloan came with the acquisition. He was made a vice president of General Motors and given responsibility for managing the company's parts and accessories divisions. Sloan had watched Durand's erratic leadership with growing alarm. He believed that General Motors was operationally dysfunctional. Each division operated independently with almost no coordination. There was no unified financial reporting system, no centralized purchasing, no coherent product planning. Divisions competed against each other for resources and market share. Some divisions were profitable, others were losing money, but no one at headquarters had a clear picture of the company's overall financial condition. In 1919, Sloan wrote a detailed organizational plan that he believed could solve these problems. He called it the Organization Study. The plan proposed a structure in which each division would retain operational autonomy but would be subject to centralized financial oversight and coordinated policy decisions. Divisions would be responsible for their own profits and losses, but headquarters would allocate capital, set production targets, and enforce uniform accounting standards. Durand had ignored the plan. Pierre DuPont did not. In 1921, DuPont appointed Sloan as vice president in charge of operations, and in 1923, Sloan became president of General Motors. DuPont remained chairman of the board, but Sloan was given full authority to implement his organizational vision. Sloan moved quickly. He created a central corporate staff responsible for financial analysis, legal affairs, engineering standards, and strategic planning. He established the General Motors Acceptance Corporation, a financing subsidiary that provided loans to dealers and customers, which allowed General Motors to sell more cars by making them easier to afford. He standardized accounting practices across all divisions so that headquarters could compare performance accurately and allocate resources efficiently. He imposed strict capital budgeting procedures that required every division to justify its spending and demonstrate expected returns on investment. At the same time, Sloan maintained the divisional structure that Durant had created. Each brand retained its own management, engineering teams, and production facilities. But now each division operated within a framework of financial accountability and strategic coordination. Division managers were judged on their profitability, their market share, and their ability to meet corporate objectives. If a division failed to perform, its management could be replaced. Sloan's approach was neither fully centralized nor fully decentralized. It was a carefully balanced system designed to combine the efficiency of large-scale operations with the flexibility and responsiveness of smaller, independent units. This structure became known as multi-divisional organization, and it would later be adopted by corporations across nearly every industry in the United States and beyond. Sloan also recognized that General Motors could not compete with Ford by simply trying to sell cheaper cars. By the early 1920s, Ford's Model T had become so dominant in the low-cost market that it was nearly impossible to undercut its price. Ford had achieved extraordinary economies of scale through relentless focus on a single model, vertical integration, and assembly line production. The Model T was utilitarian, reliable, and affordable, but it was also unchanging. Ford famously insisted that customers could have the car in any color they wanted, as long as it was black. Sloan saw an opportunity. General Motors would compete not on price alone, but on variety, style, comfort, and annual model changes. In 1923, Sloan introduced a coordinated product strategy that aligned each General Motors brand with a specific price range and market segment. Chevrolet would compete directly with Ford in the low-cost market, but would offer more features, more style, and more options. Pontiac, which replaced the Oakland brand in 1926, would target buyers who wanted something more refined than Chevrolet but could not afford Buick. Oldsmobile would serve middle-class buyers seeking comfort and reliability. Buick would appeal to successful professionals and upper-middle-class families. Cadillac would dominate the luxury market. The price ranges were carefully set so that each brand did not overlap too much with the others, and customers could move up through the General Motors product line as their income increased. This was not merely a marketing strategy. It was a comprehensive approach to market segmentation and brand management that allowed General Motors to capture a much larger share of the total automobile market than any single brand competitor could. Sloan also instituted the practice of annual model changes. Each year, General Motors divisions would introduce new models with updated styling, new features, and incremental improvements. The changes were often superficial, mostly cosmetic alterations to body panels, grilles, and interior trim, but they created a sense of novelty and fashion that made older models seem outdated. Customers who might have kept their cars for 10 years began to consider trading them in after 3 or 4. This strategy, later criticized as planned obsolescence, was enormously effective at driving repeat sales and maintaining customer interest. Ford, by contrast, continued to produce the Model T with almost no changes year after year, and by the mid-1920s, the car was beginning to look old-fashioned. General Motors invested heavily in design and styling. In 1927, Sloan hired Harley Earl, a custom car designer from California who had been creating flamboyant, Hollywood-style automobiles for wealthy clients. Earl was given unprecedented authority to shape the visual appearance of General Motors cars. He established the art and color section, which later became the styling division, the first in-house automotive design department in the industry. Earl introduced the concept of styling as a primary competitive tool. He believed that cars should be beautiful, exciting, and aspirational, not just functional. He advocated for lower, longer, sleeker body shapes, chrome trim, two-tone paint schemes, and dramatic design elements that would make General Motors cars instantly recognizable and desirable. Under Earl's direction, General Motors cars became symbols of status and modernity, and styling became as important to sales as engineering or price. In 1927, Ford finally discontinued the Model T and shut down production for several months to retool its factories for a new model, the Model A. During that time, General Motors seized a massive opportunity. Chevrolet, which had been steadily gaining market share, surged ahead. By the end of 1927, Chevrolet had outsold Ford for the first time. General Motors' total production exceeded Ford's by a wide margin, and the company's market share reached nearly 45% of all automobiles sold in the United States. Ford would never fully recover its dominance. The Model A was successful, but it could not reverse the momentum that General Motors had built through superior organization, coordinated strategy, and relentless focus on customer preferences. Sloan also understood that General Motors needed to expand internationally if it was going to sustain long-term growth. In 1925, General Motors acquired Vauxhall Motors, a British automobile manufacturer, giving the company a foothold in the United Kingdom. In 1929, General Motors acquired Adam Opel AG, a German automobile and bicycle manufacturer, which became the foundation of General Motors' operations in continental Europe. These acquisitions were managed carefully. General Motors did not impose American designs or American management practices on its European subsidiaries. Instead, it allowed Vauxhall and Opel to design cars suited to European tastes and road conditions, while providing access to General Motors' financial resources, engineering expertise, and manufacturing techniques. By the end of the 1920s, General Motors was a multinational corporation with production facilities on 3 continents. The company's financial performance during the 1920s was extraordinary. Profits grew every year. Stock prices soared. Dividends increased. By 1929, General Motors was the largest automobile manufacturer in the world, producing over 1.8 million vehicles annually. It employed more than 230,000 workers. Its annual revenue exceeded $1.5 billion. The company's success made Sloan one of the most respected executives in American business, and his management principles were studied and imitated by corporations in every industry. But the prosperity of the 1920s ended abruptly in October 1929 when the stock market crashed. The crash triggered a financial panic that spread rapidly through the banking system and the broader economy. By 1930, the United States had entered the Great Depression. Unemployment soared. Consumer spending collapsed. Automobile sales, which had reached a peak of over 4.5 million vehicles in 1929, fell to fewer than 1.5 million in 1932. General Motors production dropped by more than 70%. Factories were idled. Workers were laid off by the tens of thousands. The company's profits, which had been over $250 million in 1929, fell to a loss of several $1 million in 1932. Sloan responded to the crisis with the same disciplined approach he had used to build the company. He did not panic. He cut costs aggressively but avoided shutting down entire divisions. He maintained the company's financial stability by drawing on cash reserves and credit lines that had been carefully managed during the prosperous years. He reduced wages but avoided mass firings where possible, keeping skilled workers employed at reduced hours so that the company could restart production quickly when demand returned. He continued to invest in research and engineering, believing that General Motors needed to be ready with new models and new technologies when the economy recovered. The Great Depression transformed the relationship between American workers and American corporations. Throughout the 1920s, General Motors had maintained strict control over its workforce. Wages were determined unilaterally by management. Working conditions were harsh. Assembly line work was repetitive, physically demanding, and relentlessly paced. Workers had no formal mechanism to negotiate with management, no job security, and no protection against arbitrary dismissal. Unions existed in some American industries, particularly coal mining and railroads, but automobile manufacturing remained almost entirely non-unionized. General Motors, like Ford and other major manufacturers, actively suppressed union organizing through surveillance, intimidation, and firing anyone suspected of union sympathies. By the mid-1930s, conditions had changed. The Roosevelt administration, elected in 1932, passed the National Labor Relations Act in 1935, which legally protected workers' right to organize and bargain collectively. Labor unions, which had been weakened during the 1920s, began reorganizing with new energy and government support. The United Auto Workers, a union formed in 1935 under the umbrella of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, targeted the automobile industry for a major organizing campaign. The UAW's strategy was to unionize the largest manufacturers first, believing that once General Motors or Ford was unionized, smaller companies would follow. General Motors executives, including Sloan, were adamantly opposed to unionization. They believed that unions would disrupt production, increase costs, and undermine management's authority to run the company efficiently. They argued that General Motors already paid higher wages than most other manufacturers and provided relatively stable employment compared to smaller firms. They saw no reason why workers needed outside representation. In early 1936, the UAW began organizing campaigns at General Motors plants in Flint, Detroit, and other cities. Management responded by hiring private security firms, planting informants among workers, and firing anyone identified as a union organizer. On December 30, 1936, workers at the Fisher Body Plant No. 1 in Flint, Michigan, stopped working and refused to leave the factory. They occupied the plant, barricading doors and windows, and announced they would not leave until General Motors agreed to recognize the UAW and negotiate a contract. This was a sit-down strike, a tactic that had been used occasionally in other industries but never on this scale. The workers did not picket outside where they could be dispersed by police or replaced by strikebreakers. They stayed inside, controlling the machinery and preventing the company from resuming production. Within days, workers at other General Motors plants in Flint and across Michigan joined the strike. By early January 1937, more than 40,000 General Motors workers were either on strike or unable to work because parts production had stopped. General Motors management demanded that Michigan Governor Frank Murphy send state police or National Guard troops to forcibly remove the strikers. Murphy, a Democrat sympathetic to labor, refused. He believed that sending armed troops into the factories would result in bloodshed and would not resolve the underlying dispute. General Motors obtained court injunctions ordering the workers to leave, but the workers ignored them. The company shut off heat to the occupied factories in the middle of winter. The workers stayed. The company threatened to cut off food supplies. Supporters outside organized supply lines to bring food, blankets, and medical supplies to the strikers through windows and side doors. On January 11, 1937, police attempted to retake Fisher Body Plant No. 2 by force. They fired tear gas into the building and tried to break through the barricades. Workers inside fought back with metal car parts, bolts, and streams of water from fire hoses. The battle lasted several hours. Dozens of workers and police were injured. The police withdrew, unable to dislodge the strikers. The event became known as the Battle of the Running Bulls, and it demonstrated that the workers were willing to defend their occupation with physical force. The strike continued. Sloan, who was in New York during much of the strike, refused to negotiate with the UAW as long as workers occupied General Motors property. He issued public statements condemning the strike as illegal and demanding that law enforcement restore order. Behind the scenes, however, General Motors executives were growing desperate. Production had stopped almost entirely. The company was losing millions of dollars every day. Dealers had no cars to sell. Customers were canceling orders. Other automobile manufacturers were gaining market share. By mid-January, General Motors was facing the possibility that the strike could drag on for months, crippling the company's finances and its competitive position. On February 11, 1937, after 44 days of occupation, General Motors agreed to negotiate. Representatives from the company, the UAW, and Governor Murphy met in Detroit. The UAW demanded recognition as the sole bargaining agent for all General Motors workers, a wage increase, a reduction in the speed of assembly lines, and the reinstatement of all fired union organizers. General Motors agreed to recognize the UAW as the bargaining agent for its members, though not for all workers, and agreed not to discriminate against union members. The company did not agree to a wage increase or changes to working conditions, but it agreed to negotiate those issues in future contract talks. On February 11th, the workers left the factories. The Flint sit-down strike was over. The strike was a turning point. Within months, Chrysler Corporation and dozens of smaller automobile manufacturers also recognized the UAW. By the end of 1937, the UAW had organized most of the American automobile industry. Ford held out until 1941, when a massive strike forced Henry Ford to accept unionization. General Motors, which had fought so hard to prevent union recognition, now had to negotiate wages, working conditions, and production standards with an organization it did not control. The balance of power inside American factories had shifted permanently. The late 1930s also brought renewed economic growth. The Depression had not ended, but government spending on public works, military rearmament, and social programs had stabilized the economy. Automobile sales began to recover. By 1937, General Motors was producing over 2 million vehicles annually, approaching pre-depression levels. The company resumed paying dividends. Profits returned. Sloan continued to refine General Motors' product strategy, introducing new models and improving existing ones. In 1938, General Motors engineers developed an automatic transmission system that eliminated the need for drivers to manually shift gears. The system, called Hydromatic, was first offered as an option on Oldsmobile models and later spread to other divisions. It was one of the most significant technological innovations in automobile history and became a major selling point for General Motors cars. In 1939, war broke out in Europe. Germany invaded Poland in September, and Britain and France declared war on Germany. The United States remained neutral, but it was clear that American industry might soon be called upon to supply the Allied powers with military equipment. General Motors began receiving contracts from the British and French governments for trucks, aircraft engines, and other military vehicles. When France fell to Germany in June 1940 and Britain stood alone against the German military, President Roosevelt committed the United States to becoming what he called the arsenal of democracy. American factories would produce weapons, vehicles, and supplies for Britain and eventually for American forces as well. General Motors, with its vast manufacturing capacity, its engineering expertise, and its ability to coordinate production across dozens of factories, was ideally positioned to contribute to the war effort. In 1940 and 1941, the company ramped up military production while still producing civilian automobiles. Sloan, who had been cautious about involving General Motors too deeply in military contracts during the 1930s, now committed the company fully. General Motors factories began producing tanks, aircraft engines, machine guns, artillery shells, and military trucks. The company's engineering teams worked on developing new weapons systems, improving existing designs, and solving mass production challenges that the military had never encountered before. In December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and the United States entered World War II. Within weeks, the federal government ordered all civilian automobile production to stop. Every factory, every machine, every engineer, every worker at General Motors was redirected to military production. The company's Buick division produced aircraft engines and gun barrels. Chevrolet produced aircraft engines and military trucks. Cadillac produced tanks and aircraft engine components. Oldsmobile produced ammunition and artillery shells. Fisher Body produced aircraft fuselage sections and gun turrets. Delco, a General Motors subsidiary, produced radio equipment and electrical systems for military aircraft and ships. General Motors' total war production between 1941 and 1945 exceeded $12 billion, more than any other American corporation. The company manufactured over 200,000 aircraft engines, over 13,000 naval aircraft, over 100,000 aircraft propellers, over 38,000 tanks and tank destroyers, over 850,000 military trucks, and billions of rounds of ammunition. General Motors engineers helped design the M4 Sherman tank, the most widely used American tank of the war, and solved critical production problems that allowed the tank to be manufactured quickly and reliably. The company's factories operated around the clock, employing over 500,000 workers at peak production. Many of these workers were women, hired to replace men who had been drafted into military service. General Motors trained them, paid them less than male workers, and expected them to leave when the war ended. Sloan remained president of General Motors throughout the war, though his attention was divided between managing military production and planning for the post-war transition. He knew that when the war ended, there would be enormous pent-up demand for civilian automobiles. Americans had not been able to buy new cars since 1942. Millions of old cars were wearing out. Returning soldiers would need transportation. Families would want to move to new homes in expanding suburbs. Sloan wanted General Motors to be ready to dominate the post-war market the way it had dominated the market in the 1920s. He ordered engineers to begin designing new post-war models in secret, even while factories were still producing tanks and aircraft engines. He planned factory retooling schedules so that production could resume as quickly as possible after the war ended. In August 1945, Japan surrendered, and World War II ended. General Motors immediately began converting its factories back to civilian production. The transition was faster than anyone had expected. By the end of 1945, some General Motors plants were already producing civilian automobiles. By 1946, production was in full swing. The post-war demand was even greater than Sloan had anticipated. Customers waited months for new cars. Dealers had waiting lists. General Motors could not produce vehicles fast enough to meet demand. In 1946, the company produced over 1.5 million vehicles. In 1947, production exceeded 2 million. In 1949, it exceeded 3 million. General Motors' market share reached nearly 50% of all automobiles sold in the United States, the highest it had ever been. The post-war era transformed the American economy and American society in ways that overwhelmingly favored General Motors. Millions of veterans returned from military service with access to government-backed mortgages, educational benefits, and stable employment. The federal government invested heavily in highway construction, subsidized suburban development, and maintained policies that made automobile ownership economically rational and socially necessary. Gasoline was cheap. Parking was abundant. Public transportation systems in many cities were neglected or dismantled. The automobile became the defining feature of American middle-class life, and General Motors was the dominant producer of the machines that made that life possible. Sloan retired as president of General Motors in 1946, though he remained chairman of the board until 1956. His successor as president was Charles Owen Wilson, an engineer who had joined General Motors in 1919 and had managed the company's wartime production. Wilson continued Sloan's organizational principles and product strategies, but he also presided over an era of unprecedented growth and profitability that required less strategic innovation and more operational execution. The challenge was not to gain market share or develop new competitive advantages. The challenge was to manage scale, maintain production capacity, and satisfy a customer base that seemed insatiable. General Motors expanded its product lines and introduced new models at a relentless pace. Chevrolet, which had been General Motors' volume leader since the late 1920s, became the best-selling automobile brand in the world. The Chevrolet Bel Air, introduced in 1950, became an icon of American automotive design with its chrome trim, tail fins, and bold two-tone paint schemes. Buick flourished as the car of choice for successful professionals and upper-middle-class families. The Buick Roadmaster and the Buick Super were among the most popular large cars in America throughout the 1950s. Cadillac solidified its position as the ultimate American luxury car, and its tail fins, introduced in 1948 and exaggerated throughout the 1950s, became symbols of post-war American excess and confidence. Oldsmobile and Pontiac occupied their designated market segments with steady sales and loyal customer bases. Harley Earl, who had been shaping General Motors' design language since the late 1920s, reached the height of his influence during the 1950s. He believed that American cars should be dramatic, powerful, and visually exciting. He drew inspiration from fighter aircraft, rockets, and the emerging culture of jet travel. Under his direction, General Motors cars grew larger, lower, wider, and more flamboyant. Chrome became ubiquitous. Tailfins grew taller. Dashboard designs became more complex, resembling aircraft cockpits. Two-tone and even three-tone paint schemes became standard. The designs were not subtle, and they were not intended to be. They were statements of prosperity, confidence, and American industrial supremacy. General Motors also invested heavily in engineering and technology, though often in service of style and power rather than efficiency or practicality. In 1953, Chevrolet introduced a new overhead valve V8 engine that was lighter, more powerful, and more efficient than previous designs. The engine became legendary for its performance and adaptability, and variations of it remained in production for decades. In 1953, Chevrolet also introduced the Corvette, a two-seat sports car intended to compete with European imports. The Corvette was not initially successful, but General Motors persisted with it, and by the late 1950s, it had become an American icon. In 1955, General Motors introduced air conditioning as an option on several models, and within a few years, it became a standard expectation for middle-class buyers. The company's financial performance during the 1950s was extraordinary by any measure. Profits exceeded $500 million annually by the early 1950s and continued to grow throughout the decade. In 1955, General Motors became the first American corporation to pay over $1 billion in federal income taxes in a single year, a figure that President Eisenhower cited as evidence of the strength of the American economy. Employment at General Motors exceeded 600,000 workers by the mid-1950s. The company paid some of the highest industrial wages in the world, and its unionized workforce enjoyed health insurance, pensions, paid vacations, and job security that were unprecedented in American labor history. The UAW, which had fought so bitterly with General Motors in the 1930s, now negotiated contracts that linked wage increases to productivity gains and cost of living adjustments, creating a stable and predictable labor relationship that both sides could manage. General Motors became so dominant that it began to attract scrutiny from antitrust regulators. In 1949, the federal government filed a lawsuit alleging that General Motors' controlling interest in the DuPont Company, which supplied General Motors with paints, fabrics, and other materials, constituted an illegal monopoly. The case dragged on for years, and in 1957 the Supreme Court ruled against General Motors and ordered the DuPont Company to divest its General Motors stock. The decision had little practical impact on General Motors' operations, but it signaled that the company's dominance was being viewed as a potential threat to competition. By the late 1950s, however, subtle signs of vulnerability were beginning to appear. American cars had grown so large, so heavy, and so inefficient that they were becoming impractical for many buyers. Gasoline consumption was high. Parking was difficult. Maintenance costs were rising. A small but growing number of American consumers began purchasing imported cars from Europe, particularly Volkswagen Beetles from Germany and small sedans from Britain and France. These cars were inexpensive, fuel-efficient, and mechanically simple. They appealed to younger buyers, urban buyers, and cost-conscious buyers who did not want or need a large American sedan. In 1955, imports accounted for less than 1% of the American automobile market. By 1959, imports had grown to nearly 10%. General Motors initially dismissed the threat. Executives believed that imported cars were a passing fad, that American buyers would always prefer large, powerful, domestically produced automobiles. But by 1959, the company decided it needed a response. General Motors introduced the Chevrolet Corvair, a compact car with a rear-mounted, air-cooled engine, designed to compete with the Volkswagen Beetle and other imports. The Corvair was innovative in design and engineering, but it was also rushed to market without adequate testing. The rear engine layout made the car prone to oversteer, and early models had serious handling problems that could cause loss of control in certain driving conditions. The problems were fixable, and later versions of the Corvair were much improved, but the damage to the car's reputation had been done. A young lawyer named Ralph Nader published a book in 1965 titled Unsafe at Any Speed, which focused heavily on the Corvair's design flaws and accused General Motors of prioritizing styling and cost-cutting over safety. The book became a bestseller and helped launch the consumer safety movement. The Corvair's sales collapsed, and production ended in 1969. The 1960s brought other challenges. American society was changing rapidly. The civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, the environmental movement, and the counterculture challenged many of the assumptions that had guided American corporations since the end of World War II. General Motors, which had been synonymous with American prosperity and industrial success, began to be seen by some as a symbol of waste, pollution, and corporate arrogance. The company's cars were criticized for being too large, too inefficient, and too polluting. Its factories were criticized for contributing to air and water pollution. Its labor practices, though still better than most American corporations, were criticized for being insufficiently inclusive of black workers and women. General Motors responded slowly to these criticisms. In 1970, under pressure from new federal environmental regulations, the company began installing emission control systems on its engines. The systems reduced pollution but also reduced performance and fuel efficiency, which frustrated customers who had been conditioned to expect powerful engines. General Motors also faced increasing competition from Japanese automobile manufacturers, particularly Toyota and Nissan, which entered the American market in the 1960s with small, reliable, fuel-efficient cars that appealed to younger buyers. Japanese cars were initially dismissed by American executives as cheap and poorly built, but by the early 1970s, it was clear that Japanese manufacturers had mastered quality control and production efficiency in ways that American manufacturers had not. In 1973, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries imposed an oil embargo on the United States in response to American support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War. Gasoline prices quadrupled almost overnight. Long lines formed at gas stations. Americans suddenly became acutely aware of how much fuel their cars consumed. General Motors' fleet of large sedans, which averaged fewer than 10 miles per gallon in city driving, became liabilities. Sales of large cars collapsed. Sales of imported compact cars surged. General Motors scrambled to produce smaller, more fuel-efficient models, but the company's factories, its supply chains, and its engineering teams were all optimized for building large cars. Retooling took years. By the time General Motors had competitive small cars in production, the immediate crisis had passed, and American buyers had developed lasting skepticism about the company's commitment to fuel efficiency. The oil embargo also exposed deeper structural problems. General Motors management, which had been built on Sloan's principles of decentralized operations and financial control, had become rigid and bureaucratic. Decision-making was slow. Innovation was stifled. Engineering teams in different divisions rarely communicated with each other, which led to duplication of effort and missed opportunities for shared technology. The company's relationship with the UAW, which had been stable and productive during the 1950s and 1960s, became increasingly adversarial as the company faced pressure to cut costs and improve productivity. Strikes became more frequent. Contract negotiations became more contentious. Quality control, which had never been a strong point for American automobile manufacturers, deteriorated further as workers and managers blamed each other for the company's declining competitiveness. By the late 1970s, General Motors was still the largest automobile manufacturer in the world, but it was no longer the most profitable or the most innovative. Japanese manufacturers, particularly Toyota, were gaining market share rapidly with cars that were more reliable, more fuel-efficient, and better built than comparable General Motors models. European manufacturers, particularly Mercedes-Benz and BMW, dominated the luxury market with cars that were engineered to standards that Cadillac could not match. General Motors' market share in the United States, which had peaked at nearly 50% in the late 1940s, had fallen to around 45% by 1979. The decline was gradual, but it was unmistakable, and it would accelerate in the decades to come. The 1980s began with another oil shock. In 1979, revolution in Iran disrupted global oil supplies, and gasoline prices surged again. American consumers, already wary of large, inefficient cars, shifted decisively towards smaller, more economical vehicles. Japanese manufacturers, led by Toyota and Honda, captured an ever larger share of the American market. By 1980, imports accounted for nearly 30% of all cars sold in the United States, and General Motors' market share had fallen below 45% for the first time since the 1920s. General Motors attempted to respond with a wave of new models designed to compete with imports. In 1982, the company introduced a series of front-wheel drive compact cars under the names Chevrolet Cavalier, Pontiac 2000, Oldsmobile Firenze, Buick Skyhawk, and Cadillac Cimarron. The cars shared the same basic platform, engines, and components, differing only in trim and styling. This approach, called badge engineering, was supposed to reduce costs and allow General Motors to offer multiple products quickly. Instead, it confused customers who could not understand why they should pay more for an Oldsmobile or a Cadillac that was mechanically identical to a Chevrolet. The Cadillac Cimarron, in particular, became an embarrassment. It was little more than a Chevrolet Cavalier with leather seats and a Cadillac badge, and it damaged the prestige that Cadillac had spent decades building. Quality remained a persistent problem. General Motors cars of the 1980s suffered from high rates of mechanical failure, poor fit and finish, and designs that felt cheap compared to Japanese competitors. Consumer Reports and other automotive publications consistently rated Japanese cars higher in reliability and customer satisfaction. General Motors executives blamed the UAW, arguing that union work rules made it difficult to improve quality or implement modern manufacturing techniques. The UAW blamed management, arguing that the company refused to invest adequately in factory modernization or worker training. Both were partially correct, but the underlying problem was deeper. General Motors had become a slow, bureaucratic organization that struggled to adapt to changing markets and new competitive realities. In 1984, General Motors announced a joint venture with Toyota to produce cars at a factory in Fremont, California. The factory, called New United Motor Manufacturing Incorporated, or NUMMI, was intended to teach General Motors how Toyota achieved superior quality and efficiency. Toyota would manage the factory using its production methods, and General Motors would learn by observing. The experiment was revealing. Toyota used the same unionized American workers who had previously worked for General Motors at the same factory, which had been one of the worst performing plants in the General Motors system before it closed in 1982. Under Toyota's management, with Toyota's training methods and Toyota's production system, the same workers produced cars with quality levels comparable to those built in Japan. The lesson was clear. The problem was not the workers. The problem was General Motors' management systems, its production methods, and its culture. But General Motors did not apply those lessons systematically across its operations. Instead, the company launched an ambitious and ultimately disastrous attempt to leapfrog its competitors through technology and automation. In 1985, General Motors acquired Hughes Aircraft Company for $5 billion, intending to integrate advanced electronics and aerospace technology into automobile design. The same year, General Motors purchased Electronic Data Systems, a computer services company founded by Texas billionaire Ross Perot, for $2.5 billion. The company also invested billions in factory automation, installing thousands of industrial robots and computer-controlled manufacturing systems. The chairman during this period was Roger Smith, an accountant who had risen through General Motors' financial ranks and who believed that technology and automation could solve the company's productivity and quality problems. The strategy failed spectacularly. The robots malfunctioned frequently. The computer systems were incompatible with each other. Factory workers, who had not been adequately trained, could not operate or maintain the new equipment. Production delays became common. Quality did not improve and in some cases worsened. The acquisitions of Hughes and EDS did not produce the technological breakthroughs that Smith had promised. Ross Perot, who joined the General Motors board after the acquisition, became increasingly vocal in his criticism of the company's management and bureaucracy. In 1986, General Motors paid Perot $700 million to leave the board and surrender his stock. The entire modernization effort, which cost General Motors over $40 billion during the 1980s, produced minimal returns and left the company financially weakened. Meanwhile, Japanese manufacturers continued to gain ground. Toyota and Honda established manufacturing plants in the United States, avoiding import quotas and currency exchange issues while employing American workers. These factories, called transplants, consistently outperformed General Motors factories in productivity, quality, and cost efficiency. In 1989, Toyota introduced the Lexus brand, a line of luxury cars designed to compete directly with Mercedes-Benz, BMW, and Cadillac. The Lexus LS 400 was immediately recognized as one of the finest automobiles ever built, with engineering precision, build quality, and customer service that surpassed anything American manufacturers offered. Cadillac, which had dominated the American luxury market for decades, was suddenly competing with a superior product. General Motors' market share continued to decline throughout the 1990s. By 1995, it had fallen to 33%. By 2000, it was below 30%. The company closed factories, laid off workers, and eliminated entire brands in an effort to cut costs. Oldsmobile, one of the original divisions Durand had acquired in 1908, was discontinued in 2004 after 107 years of production. The decision was economically rational but symbolically devastating. General Motors was dismantling the empire that had once defined American industrial dominance. The company also faced enormous financial liabilities from commitments made during more prosperous times. General Motors had promised pension benefits and retiree health care to hundreds of thousands of former workers. By the early 2000s, these obligations totaled over $100 billion. The company was supporting more retirees than active workers, a ratio that was financially unsustainable. Healthcare costs alone exceeded $1,500 per vehicle produced, a burden that foreign competitors operating in countries with national health systems did not face. General Motors negotiated with the UAW to reduce these costs, but progress was slow and the fundamental problem remained. In 2008, the global financial crisis triggered an economic collapse that destroyed what remained of General Motors' stability. Credit markets froze. Consumers stopped buying cars. General Motors sales, which had been declining gradually for years, fell off a cliff. The company burned through its cash reserves within months. In December 2008, General Motors executives traveled to Washington and asked Congress for emergency loans to prevent bankruptcy. The request was politically toxic. General Motors, once a symbol of American success, was now seen as a symbol of corporate failure, mismanagement, and excess. After contentious debate, Congress approved loans totaling over $13 billion, but the money was not enough. In June 2009, General Motors filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The federal government provided an additional $30 billion to restructure the company. General Motors eliminated more brands. Pontiac, Saturn, Hummer, and Saab were all discontinued. Thousands of dealerships were closed. Tens of thousands of additional workers were laid off. The company's debts were restructured, its obligations to retirees were reduced, and its management was replaced. The federal government took a 61% ownership stake in the company, which was now called General Motors Company, a new legal entity created from the viable parts of the old corporation. The restructured General Motors emerged from bankruptcy in July 2009, smaller, leaner, and freed from many of the financial burdens that had crippled it. The company returned to profitability by 2010. It repaid its government loans by 2013. The federal government sold its remaining shares by 2014, recovering most but not all of the taxpayer money that had been used to save the company. General Motors survived, but it was no longer the dominant force it had once been. Its market share stabilized at around 17% of the American market, less than half of what it had been at its peak. The story of General Motors is the story of American industrial capitalism in the 20th century. It is a story of ambition, innovation, and organizational genius, but also of complacency, arrogance, and failure to adapt. William Durant built an empire by taking enormous risks and consolidating competitors. Alfred Sloan transformed that empire into the most efficient and profitable corporation in the world by imposing order, discipline, and strategic thinking. For decades, General Motors defined what a modern corporation could be, and its success created prosperity for millions of workers, suppliers, and communities. But the systems that made General Motors successful in the 1920s and 1950s became liabilities in the 1970s and beyond. The company that had once been the most innovative and adaptable organization in American industry became rigid, bureaucratic, and unable to respond to new competition. The empire did not collapse suddenly. It eroded slowly, over decades, until the structures that had once seemed unshakable finally gave way. What remains is a company that still bears the name General Motors, still produces millions of vehicles, and still employs tens of thousands of workers, but it is no longer the colossus that built industrial America.